Ava Martin and Lucas Reed vanished into Northwood Forest on a crisp October morning, their laughter echoing one final time through the trees. By nightfall, they were gone without a trace, triggering an investigation that would unearth decades of buried secrets, hidden identities, and a darkness far older than anyone could have imagined. On a chilly Friday morning in October 2019, the town of Silver Pines was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes just before the leaves start to fall. In earnest, nestled at the edge of Oregon's vast wilderness, Silver Pines was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone else, or at least knew of them. So when two local college students, Ava Martin and Lucas Bennett, packed up their backpacks and set off for a weekend camping trip in Northwood Forest, it didn't seem like anything unusual. They had gone camping together before. They were close friends, having known each other since high school, and both shared a love for the outdoors. It was supposed to be a short break from assignments, deadlines, and the noise of campus life. Ava was 19, majoring in environmental science. She was practical, adventurous, and always carried a field journal to jot down notes about local plants and birds. Lucas, a year older, was studying photography and had recently become obsessed with capturing natural landscapes. He brought his DSLR camera with him everywhere and had taken hundreds of pictures of Oregon's forests, rivers, and skies. Their plan was simple: drive up to the entrance of Northwood, hike a few miles into the forest, set up camp near a ridge they had read about online, and spend 2 nights under the stars. They left early, just after sunrise, with Lucas's rust-red Subaru packed with supplies: 2 tents, extra food, a water filter, a map, and a weather radio. They texted their parents once they parked near the main trailhead, letting them know they'd be out of cell service range for the weekend. That was the last anyone heard from them. When Sunday evening came and went with no word from either Ava or Lucas, their parents started to worry. Both families had expected a call or message by dinner time. By Monday morning, concern turned into panic. Calls to their phones went straight to voicemail. Messages remained unread. Lucas's mother drove to the trailhead herself and found his car still parked where they had left it 3 days earlier. A thin layer of frost had formed on the windshield. There were no signs of a struggle or damage to the vehicle. The car was locked, and everything inside seemed untouched. The sheriff's office was alerted immediately. By midday, a search and rescue team had assembled and entered the forest. Drones, search dogs, and volunteers joined the effort. Helicopters flew overhead. The terrain was rugged, and Northwood was known for its twisted paths and dense tree cover. Over the next 2 days, the search team found a small fire pit and signs of a tent setup about 3 miles from the trailhead. The ground was muddy, disturbed, and littered with leaves, making it hard to tell how long ago someone had been there. What struck investigators as strange was the absence of personal items. There were no sleeping bags, no backpacks, no food wrappers, just a patch of flattened grass and some scattered stones from the fire. No blood, no footprints leading in or out. It was as if Ava and Lucas had simply disappeared without a trace. The only item left behind was a charred marshmallow stick near the edge of the fire ring. As the hours turned into days, the story made its way into local newspapers and onto regional news broadcasts. The idea of 2 young people vanishing in such a familiar place terrified the community. People who had grown up hiking in Northwood now hesitated to go near it. Rumors began to spread. Some believed they had gotten lost, others suspected animal attacks, and a few whispered darker theories. But there were no signs of wildlife interference. No torn fabric, no blood, no drag marks. Ava's older brother remembered that she always kept a notebook during hikes. He told the investigators, and they combed the area again. On the 3rd day, Of the search, a volunteer found a small green journal buried under a fallen branch about 50 yards from the campsite. The last entry was dated the night they arrived. Ava had written about how quiet the forest was, how the stars looked clearer than she had ever seen, and how Lucas was excited to photograph a nearby rock formation the next morning. The entry ended abruptly with a single sentence. "We heard something moving in the woods." There was no punctuation, the rest of the page was blank. This discovery only deepened the mystery. What had they heard? An animal? Another person? A tree falling in the distance? There was no way to know. The journal was sent for analysis, but it offered no forensic clues, no fingerprints other than Ava's, no smudges or unusual markings. It did, however, confirm that they had made it to the forest and were in good spirits. The search continued for nearly 2 weeks. Cadaver dogs were brought in but found nothing. Thermal imaging scans revealed no signs of human presence. The weather had remained relatively stable during the time of their disappearance, with no storms or flash floods that might have caused an accident. Yet there was no evidence of them falling, drowning, or getting injured. By the end of the second week, the official search was scaled back. Volunteers still walked the trails. Posters were taped to signposts and gas station windows. But as time passed, hope began to fade. The families refused to give up. Ava's parents set up a Facebook page to gather tips. Lucas's father hired a private investigator who had experience with missing persons cases in wilderness areas. But nothing came of it. No one had seen them after they entered the forest. No witnesses, no camera footage, no credible leads. Then came the odd calls. Over the next month, Ava's family received 3 anonymous tips. 2 claimed to have seen the pair near the southern edge of the forest, and 1 insisted they had been picked up by someone in a black truck. Police followed up on each report, but none could be verified. There were no matching vehicles in the area and no new evidence was found. The town began to change. Silver Pines had always been close-knit, but now suspicion crept into everyday life. People looked over their shoulders more. Hikers stopped going into the woods. Stores stopped selling trail maps of Northwood. Something was off. Something people couldn't quite explain but felt in the air. By December, the case had gone cold, officially unsolved with no bodies, no suspects, and no clear explanation. Ava and Lucas had become 2 more faces on missing persons flyers, 2 young lives, frozen in time. But underneath the surface, something had shifted. The silence of the forest had started to whisper, and the mystery was only beginning to unfold. As winter settled over Silver Pines, snow began to blanket the trails and ridges of Northwood Forest. The disappearance of Ava Martin and Lucas Bennett still hung heavy over the town. While the official search had ended, quiet efforts continued, led by their families and a few determined locals who refused to let the case fade. People began scouring old maps, revisiting the forest's trails and digging into Northwood's past. What they found painted a disturbing picture that no one had expected. Northwood Forest was older than the town itself. Dense, wild, and largely untouched, it had always carried an air of mystery. Locals had long shared stories about strange happenings deep in the woods, disoriented hikers, sudden shifts in weather, odd sounds at night. Most of it was dismissed as folklore. But as people dug deeper, they uncovered a pattern too troubling to ignore. In 1996, a couple named Brian and Melissa Hall disappeared while backpacking through Northwood. They had told friends they'd be gone for a long weekend. When they didn't return, search teams found their tent slashed open and abandoned. Their bodies were discovered weeks later, buried in a shallow grave over 10 miles from their campsite. The case made headlines, but no arrests were ever made. The coroner's report listed multiple blunt force injuries, but no defensive wounds. It was as if they had been caught off guard. Police suspected a random attack, possibly by another hiker, but the trail went cold. Locals still remembered the shock of it, but after a few years it became just another tragedy pushed into the past. The deeper people looked, the more incidents they uncovered. A teenage boy went missing in 1978 while hunting rabbits with his uncle near the forest's southern edge. Only his rifle was found, propped against a tree. In 1983, a pair of hikers reported seeing what they believed was a person watching them from the trees. They ran back to the trailhead and never returned. Their story was dismissed as nerves. In 1990, a group of campers were woken in the middle of the night by distant screams echoing through the woods. No one else reported hearing anything, and the forest was too thick to investigate in the dark. The cases had been scattered across decades and never officially connected. But now, with Ava and Lucas gone, a grim thread began to emerge. One man, a retired deputy named Alan Mercer, had kept his own records over the years. After retiring from the sheriff's office, he had grown obsessed with the forest's unsolved disappearances. He had collected newspaper clippings, autopsy reports, and hand-drawn maps. Mercer claimed that the locations of the incidents all pointed toward a central area deep in Northwood, an area that strangely had never been part of any official search. What was most unsettling was that no two incidents were alike. Some involved missing persons, others included violent ends. A few victims were never found. There was no clear motive, no obvious suspect. It wasn't the work of a serial killer, in the traditional sense. There was no pattern in age, gender, or background. The only connection was the forest itself. Word spread quickly. Online forums picked up the story. Amateur sleuths began calling it the Northwood Curse. Some believed the forest was haunted. Others speculated about a hidden cult or a hermit living off-grid, targeting those who wandered too far from marked trails. Still others insisted it was simply coincidence and bad luck. For the families of Ava and Lucas, these theories offered little comfort. What they needed was evidence. Something tangible. But as the forest froze under snow and ice, the chances of finding new clues seemed slim. Yet the forest, it turned out, wasn't finished revealing its secrets. A group of hikers, 3 friends from a nearby town, decided to explore the lesser-known northern paths of Northwood. They weren't part of any search team, just curious, and looking for answers. Equipped with GPS cameras and winter gear, they ventured farther than most dared. About 5 miles in, they stumbled across something strange. A narrow footpath hidden beneath branches and overgrowth. It wasn't on any map, not even the old ranger charts. Following it, they came upon a ring of stones that looked like the remains of an old fire pit. Beyond that, half buried in snow, were rotting wooden posts. Fence remnants, maybe. A few 100 feet further, they found what appeared to be a collapsed structure, possibly a cabin, long abandoned. The air felt heavier there, as if the woods themselves had grown still. The hikers took photos and marked the location with GPS. When they returned and shared their findings online, the post quickly went viral. One of the images showed a symbol carved into a broken wooden beam, a triangle inside a circle. Some users claimed it resembled symbols found in occult texts or survivalist markings. Others dismissed it as graffiti, but when Alan Mercer saw the photo, he froze. That same symbol had appeared in one of the old missing persons reports from 1983. drawn by a young woman who claimed she had seen it carved into a tree near where she heard the screams. The hikers had unknowingly stumbled upon what might be a key location in the decades-long puzzle. The sheriff's department reopened the investigation. A new team was assigned to examine the northern part of the forest. Drones were sent to scan for signs of structures beneath the snow canopy. Investigators returned to the site with dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and cadaver-sensing equipment. They didn't find Ava and Lucas, but they did find bones. At first, it was believed they were animal remains, but forensic tests revealed they were human, decades old. Partial remains of two individuals were identified. One matched the dental records of Brian Hall, the missing man from 1996. The other was still unknown. This discovery changed everything. Now it wasn't just a missing persons case. It was a crime scene with historical connections. The state police joined the investigation. Cold case files were reopened. Journalists descended on Silver Pines. Suddenly, the sleepy forest town was the center of national attention. The families of Ava and Lucas held a vigil near the trailhead, hoping their children might still be found, or at the very least, that the truth would finally come out. Their pain had become a catalyst for long-buried secrets to be unearthed. And yet, through it all, the forest remained silent. The snow continued to fall, covering evidence, swallowing footprints, hiding the truth beneath its layers. Whatever had been happening in Northwood for all those years, it had stayed hidden in the shadows. Until now. The question was no longer if something was wrong in the forest, but how long it had been that way, and how many people had paid the price for its silence. Weeks passed, and the discovery of the human remains in Northwood Forest had shifted the entire investigation into high gear. Authorities were no longer looking for two missing campers. They were unraveling a decades-long mystery that pointed to a disturbing presence deep within the forest. The area where the bones were found became the center of a forensic operation. Trees were marked, soil samples taken, and layers of earth peeled back in hopes of finding more. And soon they did. Just beyond the original site, searchers found what remained of an old trail, long covered by moss, leaves, and time. It wound through thickets and overgrowth, leading deeper into an area no map had documented. As investigators carefully made their way along the path, they came upon a structure that hadn't been seen by anyone outside a few forgotten records. A small, isolated cabin, concealed by decades of tree growth and natural decay. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The roof had partially caved in, the walls were streaked with mold, and vines curled through broken window frames. But despite the rot, it was clear the place had been used. Maybe not recently, but not too long ago either. The door had been reinforced with heavy nails, a padlock hanging broken from the latch. It didn't look like a place built for shelter. It looked like a place meant to keep something in, or out. Investigators pried it open. Inside, the air was musty, damp, and thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The single room was cluttered with relics that made the hair on their necks stand up. The walls were lined with newspaper clippings, articles about missing hikers, campers, hunters. Some were from local papers, others from out of state, and a few had been torn or scratched through with thick red marker. In one corner sat a stack of journals, most of them damaged by moisture. The few legible entries were bizarre. Rants about purifying the woods, about cleansing the silence, and references to unseen watchers. But what sent shivers down the spines of those present was a locked trunk at the foot of a collapsed cot. It was heavy and rusted, and prying it open took nearly 20 minutes. Inside, they found the remnants of several backpacks, each tagged and bagged immediately. One of the items was a torn hoodie that matched a photo Ava's mother had posted online, the one she had been wearing the weekend she vanished. Beneath it was a camera, half crushed but with its memory card intact. The camera belonged to Lucas, and the memory card, against all odds, still worked. When police reviewed the files, they discovered dozens of photos from the weekend trip. The first few showed their hike into the woods, their campsite, and views of the surrounding area. There were candid shots of Ava laughing, Lucas adjusting the focus on his camera, and their small campfire. Everything seemed normal, but toward the end of the sequence, the photos took a dark turn. The second-to-last image was blurry, taken in low light. It showed what looked like a person, unmistakably human, standing just beyond the firelight. Tall, gaunt, and shrouded in darkness. The figure was watching them. The final image was taken in complete darkness, only faint outlines visible. But there was something reflective, eyes maybe, glaring back at the camera lens. These photos were never made public, but they confirmed what investigators now feared. Ava and Lucas had not gotten lost. Someone had been watching them. Someone had been close enough to approach their camp without being detected. The cabin, the journals, the camera, it all pointed to the chilling possibility that someone had been living off the grid in Northwood for years, maybe decades, hiding in plain sight. The news sent a shockwave through Silver Pines. Parents pulled their children from hiking trips. Stores removed outdoor gear displays. Town meetings grew heated with accusations and rumors. Who had been using the cabin? And more importantly, were they still out there? The discovery prompted a full-scale sweep of the forest. Every old ranger path, every forgotten trail, every remote clearing was searched. Drones equipped with thermal imaging scanned the tree canopy. Teams stayed overnight, heavily armed and prepared. For a while it seemed like they were getting close. Tracks were found near a stream bed. A rusted knife was pulled from beneath a rotting log. A hunter reported seeing movement in the distance, something fast, too large for a deer. But again and again the trail went cold. Then came a lead that changed everything. A park ranger new to the region but curious about the renewed investigation remembered a name mentioned in old department logs: Harold Pike. He had once worked for the Forestry Service, overseeing Northwood's boundaries and checking backcountry shelters. He had resigned abruptly in 1999, citing personal reasons. No follow-up had ever been made. On paper, he had vanished. Digging into his history, investigators learned Pike had once owned a cabin on the forest's edge. Records showed he had purchased the land in the late 1980s. Sold it a decade later but continued to live in a nearby trailer. When police paid a visit to the address listed in his last utility payment, they found the property still intact, locked, overgrown, and eerily quiet. Inside, they discovered an extensive map of Northwood Forest pinned to the wall, covered in markings and dates. Some were circled, some were crossed out. The oldest note was from 1977. The most recent was from October 2019, the weekend Ava and Lucas disappeared. A small cellar beneath the trailer revealed more: clothes from multiple time periods, bundles of rope, preserved food, and survival gear. There were also belongings, items tied to at least 3 known missing persons. Police had finally found their suspect, but Harold Pike was nowhere to be found. A warrant was issued. His photo was circulated nationally. Tips poured in, most of them false. But the evidence was undeniable. DNA pulled from the cabin in the woods matched traces found in his trailer. His journals, hundreds of them, suggested a long-standing obsession with the forest, with cleansing it, with watching those who entered what he considered his territory. He had used fear and isolation as his weapons. He had studied people before striking, and now he was gone. The hunt for Pike became a manhunt. The investigation had reached a terrifying new stage. No longer a cold case, no longer a mystery, but a criminal pursuit of a man believed to be responsible for at least 6 disappearances across 4 decades. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, Pike remained a ghost, slipping through the trees always one step ahead. Back in Silver Pines, the community was left to face the truth. The forest hadn't taken Ava and Lucas. A man had. A man who had lived among them, invisible for years, hiding in the wild. The question now wasn't whether he would be found, but whether he was still watching from somewhere deep in the woods. Spring arrived in Silver Pines, bringing with it a false sense of calm. The snow melted, rivers swelled, and hikers cautiously returned to the fringes of Northwood Forest. But beneath the surface, tension gripped the town tighter than ever. Harold Pike was still missing. Authorities had conducted the largest manhunt in the region's history, searching every cave, ravine, and shelter they could reach. They'd even brought in tracking dogs, helicopters, and thermal drones. But Pike had vanished without a trace. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. Public frustration grew. Families of the missing demanded answers, and social media swarmed with conspiracy theories. Some believed Pike was dead, his body hidden somewhere in the forest. Others insisted he was still alive, possibly being protected by someone in town. There were even whispers that he had accomplices, that he hadn't been working alone. The sheriff's department, overwhelmed by pressure and dwindling leads, reopened old files in hopes of finding missed connections. What they uncovered only deepened the mystery. In 1989, a ranger named Tom Kelly filed a report about an unknown man who had been spotted repeatedly in restricted parts of the forest. The man had never been identified, and the case was closed when no further sightings were reported. That man, it turned out, matched Harold Pike's description. But Kelly's notes mentioned something curious. A second figure seen with Pike, on one occasion. The identity of this second person had never been pursued. Investigators had always believed Pike acted alone, but this raised the possibility that another person had been helping him, perhaps all along. The new lead sent agents back into the community. They interviewed Pike's former neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who had crossed paths with him before his disappearance. Most described him as a recluse, quiet, intense, and deeply territorial about the forest. But one neighbor, an elderly woman named Marion Fields, remembered something others didn't. She recalled seeing a teenage boy regularly visiting Pike's trailer in the late 1990s. She assumed the boy was a relative, perhaps a nephew. But when investigators showed her photos of Pike's known family, none looked familiar. She described the boy as tall, quiet, and often carrying gear, backpacks, camping tools, and occasionally books. That tip led to a breakthrough. In a dusty storage facility outside town, police found a locker rented under a false name, one that matched a birth date connected to a missing persons case from 2001. Inside the unit were more journals, maps, and a dozen VHS tapes labeled with dates. They appeared to be recorded in Northwood Forest, showing Pike and another man, slightly younger, face often obscured but clearly familiar with Pike's routines. The two worked in silence, building traps, modifying trail signs, and marking trees with symbols. It now appeared Pike had a protege, a second person, likely trained over years, who may have carried on Pike's twisted mission, or worse, helped him escape once the investigation grew too close. The search widened. Now authorities were not only trying to find Pike but also identify this second individual, whose face had never been clearly captured. The press began calling him the Shadow. Public fear returned with full force. Parents no longer allowed children to play near the tree line. Outdoor events were canceled. Hunters began carrying more than just rifles. Many in Silver Pines began to wonder if the forest itself was cursed, or if it simply drew in a certain kind of darkness. But just when it seemed the case had grown cold, again another discovery reignited the investigation. In early May, a pair of amateur explorers, lured by online speculation, ventured deep into Northwood, retracing the route shown in the VHS tapes. Armed with high-resolution cameras and satellite phones, they planned to document the areas where Pike had operated. What they found would shock even seasoned investigators. 12 miles from the northern boundary, in a ravine hidden between steep rock walls, they found a new structure, a camouflaged shelter buried beneath branches and covered in bark and moss. Unlike the old cabin, this one was sturdier and showed recent use. The explorers didn't enter, fearing it might be booby-trapped, but they photographed the entrance and retreated to notify authorities. When law enforcement arrived, they approached with caution. The shelter had been rigged with crude alarms. Empty, cans on string, noise traps, and one spike trap aimed at the only visible entrance. Inside they found no person, but what they did find made their blood run cold. There were signs of someone living there recently, a sleeping area, preserved food supplies, and a fire pit still warm beneath a layer of ash. But more disturbing were the contents of a sealed metal box buried beneath the floor. Inside were personal items, wallets, jewelry, watches, belonging to various missing persons. Some dated back to the 1980s. All had been carefully labeled with names and dates. Ava Martin's bracelet was among them. Investigators now had physical proof that the shelter had been used by the same person or people responsible for multiple disappearances, but it was clear whoever had been living there had fled just before discovery. Tracks led away from the ravine, heading northwest toward higher elevation, but once again they vanished after a few miles. Forensic analysis of the shelter found multiple DNA samples. One belonged to Pike. Another was from an unidentified male, likely the same second individual from the tapes. No match was found in any database. Authorities feared the two men may have worked together longer than previously thought, and that this second figure might still be active, continuing what Pike started, or perhaps building his own twisted legacy. In the weeks that followed, a new theory emerged. Some investigators proposed that Pike had trained others, possibly more than just one person, that he had built a kind of ideology around the forest, manipulating young minds and molding them into what he saw as protectors of the wilderness. The journals, once thought to be ramblings, now read more like doctrine. They spoke of cleansing, corruption, of punishing trespassers, and of maintaining the purity of the wild. It painted a disturbing picture of a man who saw violence not as cruelty, but as purpose. The FBI, now fully involved, launched a broader investigation into people associated with Pike's past. They reviewed missing persons cases tied to youth, camps, survivalist groups, and nature retreats near Northwood. One case from 2003 stood out, a teenager named Jared Dalton who had vanished during a solo camping trip. His body was never found. Records showed his path would have taken him near areas Pike was known to frequent. Could Jared have become the shadowy figure seen in the tapes? The deeper the investigation went, the more tangled it became. What started as a search for two missing campers had revealed a horrifying network of secrets stretching back decades. Northwood Forest was no longer just a place where people disappeared. It was a living, breathing graveyard of stories, each one darker than the last. And though Harold Pike remained the face of the mystery, it was now clear he had not acted alone. Someone else was still out there watching, waiting, and perhaps ready to strike again. The final chapter of the Northwood Forest mystery unfolded not with a dramatic arrest or public confession, but with an eerie, incomplete silence that continued to haunt the town of Silver Pines. As summer settled in, the investigation entered its most delicate and disturbing phase. Authorities had pieced together enough evidence to confirm that the disappearances spanning nearly 4 decades were connected. Harold Pike was the central figure, but not the only one. And though he had vanished without a trace, the fear he instilled remained very much alive. The discovery of the hidden shelter deep in the ravine had proven that someone was still maintaining a presence in the forest. The DNA evidence, while confirming Pike's involvement, introduced a second unidentified man into the mix. Despite extensive testing and cross-referencing, the identity of this man, dubbed the Shadow by both law enforcement and the public, remained unknown. And then, just when it seemed like the trail had gone cold again, the case took another chilling turn. A hiker traveling a seldom-used trail near the southern edge of the forest stumbled upon a cave entrance, partially hidden behind a curtain of vines and fallen rock. The area was far from any known path or shelter, and had gone unsearched in previous sweeps. Inside, the hiker found evidence of a temporary camp, an extinguished fire, food wrappers, and a single blood-stained shirt. They left immediately and contacted the authorities. Investigators reached the site within hours. The cave was small, claustrophobic, and reeked of decay. Deep inside, they found bones, human remains, partially buried and wrapped in plastic sheeting. Nearby was a weathered journal, its pages filled with erratic handwriting, dark philosophies, and confessions that brought more horror than closure. The journal did not belong to Harold Pike. The writing style, the references to events after Pike's disappearance, and the recurring use of the term, "he showed me the way," pointed to a different author. Investigators now had confirmation that Pike had passed on his twisted ideology to at least one follower. The journal described rituals performed in the forest, surveillance techniques for tracking hikers without being seen, and justifications for each cleansing. Several pages listed names and dates that matched those of missing persons. Among them was Ava Martin. Her name was circled twice, followed by the words, "She knew something. She saw the cabin." What had started as a theory was now fact. There was an organized effort behind these disappearances. Whether it had grown into a cult or simply remained a secret partnership, the effect was the same. Lives had been taken and the perpetrators had remained undetected for years. Investigators scoured the cave and surrounding area for more evidence. They found what looked like another exit, leading to a narrow ravine that wound out of sight. It was determined the cave could have been used as a temporary hideout, a place for transition, not residence. Whoever had been there had moved on, likely tipped off by the increasing law enforcement presence. But the most disturbing discovery was a set of photographs found buried in a weatherproof container. The photos, aged but well preserved, depicted individuals in the forest at various times of day, many taken without the subject's knowledge. Some showed campers sitting by fires unaware they were being watched. Others were taken closer, too close, capturing sleeping figures in tents, or lone hikers resting with their backs turned. Several matched the appearance of people who had gone missing over the years. These weren't just trophies, they were records, evidence of stalking and methodical tracking that painted a chilling picture of how calculated the operation had become. In the final days of summer, authorities began to consider the unthinkable. Harold Pike might not just have inspired a single protege. He could have created a system, an ideology that spread quietly, invisibly, through those willing to listen. Perhaps he had encountered certain individuals who felt the same disdain for the outside world, the same longing for isolation, and the same violent conviction that the forest should remain untouched by outsiders. What if the disappearances weren't random acts by a single man, but coordinated choices by multiple people hiding behind the same belief? Law enforcement formed a special task force to monitor activity in the region. They installed new surveillance equipment throughout Northwood Forest, created psychological profiles based on the journal entries, and issued warnings to nearby towns. Still, no arrests were made. No bodies beyond the ones already discovered were recovered. And no one, not Pike, not the Shadow, not anyone, came forward. The FBI, in a confidential briefing, informed local authorities that the case was officially being treated as an open, multi-suspect investigation into a potential domestic extremist network. To the public, however, the narrative remained simpler. Harold Pike, the recluse-turned-predator, had either died or vanished into the very woods he had once ruled. It was easier to digest, easier to package for the media, and more comforting to those who lived on the forest's edge. But those closest to the investigation knew better. For them, the case wasn't over. It had merely gone quiet. Back in Silver Pines, the forest took on a different presence. It no longer felt like a refuge for peace and solitude. Instead, it stood as a looming symbol of unanswered questions. Trails remained open, but foot traffic was minimal. Even experienced hikers admitted feeling watched, as if the woods were no longer just trees and trails, but something sentient and aware. Residents stopped walking their dogs near the edge. Children were told never to stray from yards. Fear, once fleeting, had become part of daily life. Ava and Lucas's families eventually held a memorial, choosing to honor their memory in the clearing near the lake where they had first set up camp. The ceremony was quiet, private, and filled with sorrow. There were no bodies to bury, only the remnants of their lives and the knowledge that something had taken them, something carefully hidden for years beneath the canopy of Northwood. In the years that followed, the case was occasionally mentioned in true crime forums, podcasts, and documentaries. The story always began the same. 2 campers go missing. A forest hides dark secrets. A recluse becomes the central suspect. But what made the story linger, what made it impossible to forget, was the lack of closure. Harold Pike was never found. Neither was the man investigators believed was his partner, and the true number of victims might never be known. Northwood Forest remains open to this day. Its trails are marked, its boundaries monitored, and its history never far from the minds of those who walk beneath its trees. Some come seeking adventure, others the thrill of mystery. But all are warned, stay on the path, travel in pairs, and never ignore the feeling that someone might be watching. Because in Northwood, the silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's waiting.